folks. Make sure that my volume is up again. Folks, today I come before you to address a question as old as civilization itself. Is a utopian society possible? As we embark on this intellectual journey today, let us begin by defining a utopian society. Thomas More, in his seminal work, Utopia, published back in 1516, envisions a society where private property does not exist and the people collectively govern themselves in harmony. It's a world without war, conflict, or significant suffering, a vision that has tantalized thinkers and philosophers and dreamers alike for many centuries. A utopian society is fundamentally a conception of an ideal state, characterized by a system where every individual's needs are satisfied without strife. But as we deliver further into the fabric of societal constructs, it becomes essential to delineate the thin, often blurred line that separates a utopian society from its antithesis, a dystopian society. While both are constructs of human imagination, their essence and the principles that govern them are diametrically opposed. Anyone with a Netflix subscription has likely seen a wide array of fictional dystopias blast across their television screens. If you type dystopian films into Wikipedia, it spits out a list of 233 movies spanning from 1922's Dr. Mabuse the Gambler to the latest installment of the Hunger Games saga. And that's just films, folks. Dystopian societies of the future are also extremely popular theme for television shows, video game plots, and of course, video game plots, re-envisioned into TV shows. These are societies fraught with suffering, injustice, and the suppression of freedoms. Dystopias are typically marked by dehumanization, totalitarian governments, environmental disaster, or other characteristics associated with the cataclysmic decline in society. George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World paint vivid pictures of such societies where control over the masses is achieved through surveillance, manipulation of truth, and, of course, the suppression of individual freedoms. While such scenarios make for riveting entertainment from the comfort of your couch, nobody wants to battle out their Netflix playlist in real life. Well, perhaps there's some. Sadly, it's a slippery slope from utopia to dystopia, and dystopian society often emerges from utopian dreams gone awry. Such a journey can often begin with the noblest intentions. In attempting to create a perfect society, the very mechanisms installed to achieve harmony and equality can mutate into tools of oppression. The desire for uniformity can lead to the enforcement of conformity, squashing diversity and individual expression. Take, for instance, in trying to eliminate economic disparities, a society might enforce a rigid form of communism that eventually restricts personal freedoms and creates a police state, as depicted in Orwell's narratives. Now, back to our original question about the feasibility of a working utopian society. Well, an ideal world is extremely unlikely. First, let us consider the human factor. Psychological studies suggest inherent traits such as greed, ambition, and desire for power are indelible parts of our nature. Renowned psychologist Steven Pinker argues in The Better Angels of Our Nature that these tactics can be mitigated but not eradicated. He says the utopian vision is based on a flawed premise that humans are malleable enough to forego their individual desires for the collective good. This insight brings us to our first obstacle, the immutable complexity of human nature. Looking at historical attempts to create utopian societies provides us with a ground for analysis. Take the example of the Oneida community in the 19th century America. Despite its initially successful communal living arrangements, it ultimately dissolved due to internal conflicts and external pressures. As historian Spencer Claude notes, the failure of Oneida was rooted in its inability to reconcile individual needs with the collective good, highlighting the practical difficulties of maintaining such a society. Moreover, let us address the economic implications. A utopian society, as it's typically imagined, requires an economic system that distributes resources equitably among all its members. However, economic Friedrich Hayek in The Road to Serfdom asserts that such economical arrangements inevitably lead to totalitarianism due to the centralized control required to manage resources. The delegation of such authority, Hayek warns, leads to a loss of freedom, as central planning becomes more about control than equitable distribution. Finally, let us not forget the environmental dimension. A true utopian society would require sustainability at its core. Yet, as the United Nations reports, human activity has altered almost 75% of the Earth's surface, pushing the biosphere beyond sustainable limits. The daunting task of reversing this trend is yet another hurdle on the path to utopia. So let's ask, can technology perhaps pave the way to a utopian society? The modern age has seen significant advances, with artificial intelligence and robotics promising to eradicate much of human toil. Yet, as Shoshana Zuboff points out in her critique, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, these technologies often lead to greater surveillance and control, not less. Instead of liberating us, Zuboff argues, technology has become a tool for monitoring and managing us under the guise of convenience. The more a society relies on technology to manage its citizens' lives, the closer it may inevitably be as it edges towards a dystopian reality. While the idea of a utopian society is a noble one, it is fraught with challenges. The ethical paradoxes that arise in the pursuit of a utopian society often catalyze the development of dystopian conditions. In the quest to achieve a perfect state, what rights are we willing to forfeit? At what point does the pursuit of communal good infringe too much upon individual rights? These questions highlight the ethical battlegrounds on which the lines between utopia and dystopia are drawn. From the depths of human psychology to the complexities of economic systems and environmental sustainability, many obstacles block us from achieving the utopian dream. Perhaps instead of striving for an unattainable perfection, we should instead focus on realistic improvements to our societal structure, aiming not for a perfect society, but for a better one. As an example of what can be pragmatically done to improve our human societies, the Nordic countries, such as Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, have implemented social welfare systems that far surpass what we have here in the United States. These countries have consistently ranked high in global quality of life assessments, and there is much we can learn from them. First, let's talk about healthcare. In the United States, healthcare is a significant financial burden for many, and we've covered this on this show many times. According to a 2021 study, the U.S. spends approximately 17% of its GDP on healthcare, compared to Sweden's 11%. Yet the life expectancy in Sweden is higher. The key difference? Sweden provides universal healthcare. This system is not just about healthcare for all, it's about preventative care, which reduces long-term cost. Education in these Nordic countries is another beacon of their success. In Sweden, college education is free. Yeah, free. This contrasts, of course, with the United States, where student loan debt reached an astronomical $1.7 trillion in 2021. The investment in education in these Nordic countries leads to a more skilled workforce and promotes innovation and economic growth. But how can the government afford to offer these programs? Well, the answer is raising taxes. But please stop cringing and just listen for a second. Yes, the citizens of these countries pay more in taxes. But what they get in return is substantial savings in basic cost of living. It's not just about healthcare and education, it's about parental leave, childcare, unemployment benefits, and more. The taxes people pay are a true investment in their society's quality of life. Now let's consider a common misconception that higher taxes lead to outrageously high costs of living and suppressed wages. In reality, the wages in Nordic countries are competitive. For instance, the average salary in Sweden is comparable to the United States. But when you factor in the benefits of social programs, well, the Swedes come out ahead. And these costs aren't just being passed on to consumers. Due to efficient government spending and high levels of trust in government institutions, these countries manage to provide high quality services without the need for an exorbitant pricing scheme. The result of this investment in social welfare is a population that enjoys a high quality of life. The World Happiness Report consistently ranks these Nordic countries at the very top. This ranking considers factors like economic wealth, social support, life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, generosity, and perceptions of corruption. These societal advantages raise the population spirit so high that they don't even care about living in such a cold climate. Next, let's turn our gaze inward and compare the quality of life in Nordic countries to the situation we have here in the United States of America. We are a nation of unparalleled wealth and technological advancements, and yet we are marred by deeply ingrained issues of poverty, inequality, and systemic neglect of the basic needs of our fellow citizens. In America, poverty is not an abstract concept. It's a living reality for millions. As of the latest reports, approximately 11.4% of Americans live in poverty. And if you do any research to find out how the government defines poverty, well, you'll see that 11.4% is kind of bullshit. It's far, far higher. But poverty in the United States is not just about income. It's about access to basic necessities such as healthcare, education, and housing. The inequality in the United States is stark. The top 1% of Americans hold a disproportionate share of the nation's wealth, while the middle and lower classes struggle to keep up with the rising cost of living. Consumer debt in the United States has reached alarming levels, primarily driven by healthcare costs, education loans, and, of course, housing. As of 2023, the total U.S. consumer debt stood at around $15 trillion, a testament to a system that often prioritizes profit over people and the well-being of their society. A U.S. citizen's life expectancy, once among the highest in the world, has been declining rapidly over the years. Factors such as the opioid epidemic, obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, compounded by a healthcare system that is inaccessible to many, have contributed to this decline. The U.S. also has a higher infant mortality rate compared to other developed countries, a glaring indicator of the gaps in our healthcare system and the hypocrisy of so-called pro-lifers. One of the most disturbing reflections of our societal issues is the state of homelessness. A significant percentage of the homeless population in the United States are not unemployed. They're working adults who simply cannot afford the cost of housing. Let me say that again. A significant percentage of the homeless population in the United States are, in fact, employed. This reality, again, speaks just volumes about the widening gap between wages and the cost of living here in America in comparison to Nordic countries. The higher price of living in America does not correspond to a higher quality of life. In many of our cities, the cost of housing, healthcare, and education has skyrocketed, making it increasingly difficult for the average citizen to afford a decent standard of living. But perhaps the most damning indictment of our system is the sheer inhumanity and immorality it reflects when we fail to take care of our fellow citizens. The Nordic countries show us that this is possible. That yes, it's possible to create a society where everyone has access to healthcare, education, and a safety net in times of need. They demonstrate that a nation's greatness is not measured by its GDP or military might, but how well it treats its most vulnerable citizens. In contrast, our system often abandons those in need. The lack of universal health care, the crippling student debt, the unaffordable housing, and the inadequate social safety nets are not just policy failures, they are moral failings. They reflect a society that has often placed individual gain over communal well-being. As we look to the future, we must ask ourselves, what kind of nation do we want to be? Do we want to continue down a path where the rich get richer while the poor struggle to survive? Or do we want to build a society that uplifts everyone, that values human life and dignity above all else? The Nordic model is not a panacea, but it offers valuable lessons that we can learn from and improve upon as we build our system from the ground up. It shows us that it is possible to create a society that combines economic efficiency with social equity. It challenges us to envision a new American dream, one where prosperity is shared, where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, and where taking care of each other is not just a responsibility, but a cornerstone of our national identity. But as we reflect on these profound disparities and the shining examples set by the Nordic countries, it's imperative to acknowledge that change, especially of such magnitude, is inherently difficult and long fought. The path towards implementing policies akin to those in Nordic countries in the United States will neither be swift nor straightforward. However, the long-term benefits, both tangible and intangible, will far outweigh the challenges of this transition. Look, change by its very nature is met with resistance. Altering the status quo, especially in a nation as large, complex, and diverse as the United States, involves confronting entrenched interests, navigating bureaucratic complexities, and shifting deep-seated cultural attitudes. The transformation towards a more equitable society will require a comprehensive restructuring of our economic, healthcare, and social systems. This is no small feat. But we must remember that change did not happen in a vacuum. It requires the collective will and concerted efforts of the entire society. It calls for a visionary leadership, bold policymaking, and most importantly, the engagement and support of the citizens. Every one of us has a role to play in shaping this future. The road to such systemic change is often littered with obstacles. There will be economic hurdles as we adjust to higher taxation and redistribution policies. Politically, there will be battles as various interest groups push back against reforms that threaten their established privileges. Socially, we must overcome a mindset that often views government-led initiatives with skepticism or disdain. There will be a transitional phase that may cause discomfort as we adjust to new ways of doing things. But this is the pain of growth, of progress. It's the discomfort that comes from breaking out of old restrictive molds and stepping into a space that is more inclusive, equitable, and just. Let us not be deterred by the scale of these challenges. History has shown, time and time again, that the most meaningful and lasting changes are those that are the hardest fought. The benefits of implementing a more Nordic-like model in the United States are vast. We're talking about a future where no American has to choose between receiving healthcare and financial ruin, where education is a right and not a privilege reserved for those who can afford it, where the elderly can retire with dignity, and where every child, regardless of their socioeconomic background, has a fair shot at success. Yet, in our quest for improvement, we must tread cautiously, ever vigilant of the delicate balance between the collective good and individual freedom. This dialogue between the ideal and the cautionary reminds us that our efforts to better the world must continually be checked by the wisdom of our past experiences and the diversity of our present needs. We seek a future that moves solidly in the direction of utopia without dissolving into dystopia of nightmares and Hollywood blockbusters. But since widespread societal change will be a long time in coming, my friends, today we are joined by a guest who will share his ideas on how we can improve the social well-being of our families and communities right here in the here and now. Jeff Epstein is a former digital marketing media pioneer who has taken a critical stance on the digital age's impact on our quality of life. Jeff argues that despite unprecedented access to information, our society faces significant declines in health, financial stability, and social cohesion. He's not just a critic, but also a provocative leader, having established the quality of life resistance movement to combat these issues. Through a series of insightful questions, we're going to explore Jeff's analysis of our digital dependencies, the rise of what he calls institutional tyranny, and his proposed calls to action to restore and protect our quality of life. So join us as we delve into the critical issues and more and uncover potential paths forward in this thought-provoking conversation ahead. That's the final word up front. My name is Sean Steinhardt, and this is Crusade America. And we are back. And I want to let everyone who's listening out there know that if you've got any questions for our guests, please feel free to go ahead and visit our YouTube live stream, or you can also view us on Facebook and just put your questions in the comments and we will get to them when possible. Thank you so much. Okay, let's bring in our guest, Jeff Epstein.
Hi, hey Sean, it's Jeff Einstein.
Oh God, I'm sorry.
People aren't sure they're seeing it right when they see it. Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Epstein was the guy who killed himself in the jail cell, despite the fact that everybody else wanted to kill him first.
Yes. I think that's what was on my mind for some reason, because I was just reading about that.
I have that kind of face. What can I tell you?
No. So you heard me talk about some of the problems that we have in our society, and your argument is that a lot of this disruption in our lives has come from the digital age and technologies that we've come to pretty much depend upon. Is that a correct assessment of your views?
Well, I would suggest that the digital age is a manifestation of a deeper malaise. The digital age basically came on the heels of the 20th century, on the cusp of the 21st century. And by that time, we had effectively divorced ourselves from our spiritual underpinnings as a nation, as a society and a culture. So I think that once you do that, I talk a lot about fulfilling our four basic needs. And in the order of importance, I list them as spiritual, social, emotional, and physical. That as you start divorcing yourself spiritually in order to pursue convenience or comfort or whatever else is going on in your life, you find that other components of your life, once you divorce yourself spiritually, it becomes harder to maintain your social relationships. Once it becomes harder to maintain your social relationships, you start to suffer emotionally. And once you start to suffer emotionally, eventually that manifests in physical form. So think of it as a series of tributaries feeding into this reservoir. And by the time we get to our healthcare system, at the end of the day, we've had all this toxic garbage flowing downstream into it. So we wind up the healthcare system that you described in your monologue is really a repository for all of our shitty behavior.
Right.
So I would suggest that the first thing we need to look at is our connection with a higher power, however you might define that one way or the other, and that the problems we're encountering now in this society, because it started out essentially as a society based in Judeo-Christian ethic and in religion, and with safeguards were put on it to make sure that the government and government institutions didn't disturb those relationships with our religion. People seem to think that somehow the separation of church and state was put in place to protect the state, but it was the other way around. It was, separated church and state is supposed to protect your essential freedom to believe and worship any God you want.
Right.
And that's why it's in all the courtrooms. That's why it's on the money. That's why it's in the Pledge of Allegiance. It's everywhere we look for that reason and that reason only, to remind us that the essential moral authority comes from other than ourselves.
Right.
Well, I would suggest that the quality of life resistance movement is simply my response to the decline in the quality of our lives in the 21st century due to the rise of what I call Huxwell. It's my antidote to Huxwell.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment. First, I'm wondering, can you describe what you believe are the key factors that have led to the decline in quality of life in the 21st century, and all this despite the advancements that we have had in technology and information?
Yes, I trace it back to the early 21st century with the confluence of state-sponsored default addiction. It was at about that time that we all became addicts to media. In 2004, the Middletown Media Studies out of Ball State University concluded that the average American consumed more than 11 hours of media each and every day.
I'm sorry, say that again.
The average American consumed, and this is back in 2004, from the Ball State University Middletown Media Studies concluded that the average American consumes more than 11 hours of media each and every day. This was before social media and before smartphones.
So what are we talking about then? We're talking about just like news programming, television, radio, online. The .com era had already come and gone, thankfully, and we were entering a time when digital scale was starting to announce itself in our lives, and not only in the form of media consumption, but in all the institutional relationships. So I basically saw the confluence of state-sponsored addiction, default addiction, and the question was, what happens when addiction becomes the rule rather than the exception in our lives? What happens to our time and money and freedom when we become by default addicts across the society? So I saw that factor on the rise in the early 21st century, announced, pretty much formally announced by this media study. It was the first large-scale observational study of Middle American media consumption habits, and I saw the confluence of that with what I call runaway digital scale, the rise of runaway digital scale, which started to manifest in our lives as all these institutions in our lives that were suddenly made twice as big and twice as powerful as they were the previous decade because of digital technology. All those banks and all those major corporations that were way too big to fail back in the 1990s are now suddenly twice as powerful and only half as accountable. And everyone saw that happen as a result of 2008, when someone thought it was a great idea to bail out the banks with $8 trillion of fiat currency. Right.
So I saw this confluence of factors. One, the default state-sponsored default addiction, and two, the rise of runaway digital scale as manifested in institutional tyranny, defined as something you can't walk away from. And that definition fits both the addiction and the digital scale. We have no choice. You want to get your word out. You want to work as a podcaster, or you want to work in publishing or a content producer, whatever it is, you got to do it online nowadays. You can't walk away from it anymore. Right. And the first freedom that all addictions, regardless of their narcotics, steal from us is the freedom to walk away, the freedom not to participate. That's gone.
What do you think is the most dangerous media platform for people? Has it become the internet?
I think it's generally whichever one they use the most. So if they watch TV 20 hours a day, TV is a dangerous drug for them. If they're online, and with variations on those themes, of course, at any given point in time. But generally speaking, it's whatever drug you're taking at the time, whatever your drug of choice is at the time, whether it's TV or Substack or TikTok, Facebook, Google, whatever. They're all, addiction is never about the specific narcotic. Addiction is always about the behavior. And addictive behavior is pretty much always the same regardless of the narcotic. And that's why heroin addicts behave pretty much like compulsive gamblers, who behave pretty much like cocaine addicts, who behave pretty much like sex addicts. And you can just go down run across the entire spectrum, and you'll find that every addict is behaving pretty much the same way, regardless of the narcotic. And we all tend to think, we all make the same basic mistakes in our lives. We all tend to underestimate the power of the narcotic and overestimate our ability as individuals to defer the addiction.
Right.
So it's just a human nature. Everybody, works the same way with everybody, and the risk-reward mechanisms, the chemical risk-reward mechanisms of the brain is the same regardless of the drug.
Right. I think I read somewhere that most Americans now get their news directly from Facebook.
Wherever, pick your poison. I haven't watched or listened to the news in decades, just because I can't. It's not news. It's show business.
Absolutely, yes.
It's designed to compel us. Matt Taibbi's book "Hate Inc." and Noam Chomsky's book "Manufacturing Consent."
Yeah.
Those are books about an industry that primarily manufactures hatred as a means to sell eyeballs to advertisers. We're not, I think one of the big mistakes that people make when they think about consuming media, if they think about it at all, and most of the time we don't. To the extent that we think about it at all, most people think of the commercial ad model as the ads supporting the programming, when the exact opposite is the case. The ads aren't there to support the programs. The programs are there to support the ads. The advertiser is the only audience that matters in that deal. And we are now the product. Your eyeballs are the product. Big data is the product, regardless of what's being sold or offered, in the actual ad. It all boils down to pretty much the same thing. So I don't consume news anymore, except if somebody says to me, "You got to watch this," or whatever,
Right.
I try to be a good guest when I'm in other people's places and not tell them what shitty programs they're watching. That doesn't work at all.
So it sounds like we've already devolved. Well, it also feels like we've already devolved into a dystopian society.
Yes, we have, and that's why I call it Huxwell. It's a 21st century totalitarian dystopia that combines the compliance mechanism of state-sponsored default addiction per Aldous Huxley's 1984, his Brave New World, because that's what that book was all about, with the enforcement mechanisms of 24/7 surveillance, state-manufactured hatred via mass formation psychoses, repeated mass formation psychoses, perpetual war, and institutional tyranny, all borrowed from George Orwell's 1984. So we have the perfect amalgam right now. I started out originally in the early 21st century writing about the Aldous Huxley, because what first captured my attention was the rise of this default addiction. Once I read that report and started trying to figure out another explanation for all that media consumption, it occurred to me that sometimes Occam's razor is the easiest, simplest explanation is the best. And the simple explanation is that we're all hapless addicts right now. And there are certain things, and that led me over time to the enforcement mechanism, which really didn't start gelling in my own head until the rise of Donald Trump and Trump derangement syndrome as the second of what I call 3 mass formation psychoses to grip the American society in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And once I saw the response to the election of Donald Trump as president and the militarization of all these government agencies, and they were all sort of working in lockstep because they all hated him. They all wanted to get rid of him as quickly as possible because he's just poison. He's toxic to everyone in Washington, D.C., and that's why they spared no effort and it took extraordinary effort to get rid of him the whole time. They just couldn't stand him being there. So the totalitarian part was not Donald Trump. The totalitarian part was the response to Donald Trump because it marshaled the support of just about every major government agency, corporate media, the techno media, the big techno media players, just about every meaningful institution in the country joined forces to get rid of Donald Trump, and that by definition is totalitarianism.
Right. To be fair on that measure, though, much of Donald Trump's rhetoric and policies were also very totalitarianism and very much in line with the industries that we're talking about.
Well, listen, he didn't get there in a vacuum, no doubt about it. And he had to have some support from some institutions and some industries. But by and large, if you look at those industries that shape culture and society, right now we're talking about corporate media and techno media, the big digital guys. We're looking at the entertainment industry. We're looking at the education system from K through 12 and academia. We're looking at the major municipal markets, the big blue markets, I guess some people would call them, which are full of the biggest media addicts, because that's not only where they consume 10 to 15 hours of media every day, it's where they produce all the media everybody consumes. So if you just take a look at the meaningful institutions, those that guide policy in the end and create and trickle down to affect us in our day-to-day lives, the centralized government has never been more powerful. It's never been bigger. It's never been imbued with more cash and more mandate than it is right now. And most of it was pretty much arrayed against Donald Trump, and it still is. Most of the fortune, you look at who's controlling the Fortune 100 companies right now, it's the guy who's sitting in the DEI, what do they call them? The diversity chair, or the guys that are running HR right now. So all those things they're taking graduates out of the top Ivy League and top 12 liberal arts schools in the country, and they're all 10 to 1, basically progressive, and they all feed into the high-tech industries. They all feed into the entertainment industries. They all feed into municipal governments and education. And, it's pretty clear who's holding the reins right now in spite of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is an anomaly. He'll be gone. If he gets elected this time, he'll be gone in another 4 years. And the chances are that he won't have done much to meaningfully change the culture. And right now, his culture is a culture of excess, and that includes most perniciously power, money and power. So one of the problems I have with any utopian vision is that it almost always results in excess. And addiction, by definition, is a state of excess. In the same way that abstention, by definition, is an extreme state. And why I wouldn't counsel abstention. I'm all about moderation in all things. So I don't think we have moderation in terms of the political power structure in this country right now. Even though the country's pretty evenly split 50-50, that's simply not where the power centers are. The power centers are pretty much on both coasts right now, and the flyover states are just that in terms of the general mix and influence in the culture right now. So, that's my explanation for where we are right now. It's basically a confluence of state-sponsored default addiction and runaway digital scale.
Now,
and that's the biggest problem with digital.
You used to be a leading a leader in digital media, correct?
Yeah, I was like the original Mr. Digital in New York City. I wrote, thanks to my last name, I wrote the first major how-to book series on personal computer called Einstein's Computer Guides back in 1984. And later that same year, I co-founded the nation's first digital advertising agency, which we sold in the mid-1990s. So just as everyone else was getting into it, I was looking for the exit sign because I was already feeling uneasy. I stayed on as a consultant because I had to do something and I had a family to afford in New York City. But pretty much ever since the late 1990s and the early 21st century, when I turned state's witness with the digital downside, I've been looking to redeem myself and from my prior contributions, which I'm not happy about. But who knew?
Yeah.
But that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that we now have the technology to do whatever we want, and the first question we ask is, "Can I do this?" And the first question should be, "Should I do this?"
Right. Absolutely. Well, it's become all about profits too. It's centered on greed over equitable resources.
Well, the biggest problem I have with all utopian is the thought that that utopia is something we should strive for in the first place. I have a problem with the idea of striving for utopia. I like the idea of making things better and working incrementally and working and doing what we can to divorce ourselves from centralized power on a local autonomy basis and in our own backyards and at our own dinner tables, which as an institution all but disappeared some time ago, and we're feeling the results of that disappearance now, that vacuum now, because we have no more local news. All our local news used to come around the dinner table. All the actionable news used to come around the dinner table. We don't have that anymore because we got rid of it and we gave that job over to a bunch of fucking talking heads who don't give a flying rat's ass what's happening in our backyards or in our communities. So, we made our beds. Now we're sleeping in them, and everybody's sort of scrambling, looking for the way out. And that's why I devised the quality of life resistance movement to provide a roadmap out.
Okay, let's talk about that movement. What are the key pillars of the movement?
There are three primary calls to action, and they're all come in response to the rise of Huxwell. The three primary calls to action are: number one, to turn away from distraction and return our attention to those things and people that contribute to the spiritual, social, emotional, and physical well-being in our lives. The ancient Vedic seers 3,000 or 4,000 years ago once observed that we have a tendency to become our attention. So the first call to action is to do what we can to turn away from distraction and turn back to the people, our families, and our communities in our own backyards. I'll come back to that in a second. The second call to action is to do what we can to moderate excessive behavior in our own lives, which means first and foremost to moderate our excessive media consumption, because that's the primary gateway drug of choice right now. That's just the default drug. So I provide I have a series of tools in the Quality of Life Toolkit on the Substack blog, on the Quality of Life Resistance Movement.
And I placed the URL right there for people. It's let me just go ahead and provide it to our radio audience too. HTTPS, the rest, QOLRM.substack.com. QOLRM.substack.com. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I just wanted to let our audience know about this.
Thank you. So the second call to action basically is to do what we can to moderate our behavior in response to this default addiction that has basically afflicted everyone in the society. And I mentioned it before. You'll find that the tools and the techniques I describe are all designed to impart moderation in our lifestyle as opposed to abstention. Abstention typically and statistically, moderation is the only proven way to deal with addiction on a large-scale basis. Abstention is just another form of extreme behavior, and it explains why statistically abstention-based programs, most 12-step programs, don't have no program has particularly high long-term recovery rates in addiction. And typically what happens with people's lives, take for instance the inveterate college drunk. I'll have to take other people's word for it because I never went to college, but my understanding, everybody had a friend who was an inveterate college drunk. And for all intents and purposes, they were alcoholics while they were in college. But they get out of college and they go and they get a job, and then they meet someone they fall in love with, and they buy a house, and they keep assuming more and more responsibilities in their lives. And essentially these responsibilities and obligations compel them to moderate their behavior. They have to show up for work. They have to do their job at a certain level. They have to show up after work and to have dinner and take care of their loved ones and their families and see to their domiciles. And as people assume more responsibility in their lives, we have a tendency then to mature out of our addictions. That's the way it works. Most people who recover from addiction do so with absolutely no third-party intervention whatsoever and no medical or expert intervention whatsoever. And most people do so by moderating their lives and maturing out of their addictions over time. That doesn't mean that addiction won't return, and it typically does, and usually more than one at a time. But again, the same thing holds true, that even after tough times, when we become addicts, the only statistically viable way to get out of it, basically, is to find ways to moderate your behavior. And that's what my techniques and tools are designed to do. They're designed to help people introduce what I call meaningful ritual back in their lives, because the process of addiction is something that happens when the mindless addictions that we build to protect around our addictions and obsessions, obsessive compulsive behaviors, those things that we build around to protect them, basically, take over and replace the meaningful rituals in our lives. The dinner table, the Sabbath day of rest, going to church or synagogue or whatever, prayer, exercise, all these other meaningful rituals that contribute to one or more of our four basic needs, our spiritual, social, emotional, and physical needs. Those are the rituals that protect the quality of our lives and impart quality of life. As our addictive rituals over time, and sometimes it happens quicker than we might like, but as they happen over time to replace those meaningful rituals, that's how we become addicts. So all addiction recovery programs, regardless of the specific techniques, seek to reverse engineer that process. So if you're an Alcoholics Anonymous, and instead of going to a bar after work for that drink with your buddies, you make a program call, or you go to a meeting, or you somehow or other replace that bar ritual built around the addiction with a more meaningful ritual that protects the quality of your life. That's how we recover. That's how we learn to live with our addictions, even if we don't recover. And most people I know who were alcoholics at one point in their lives or other in their lives, although I've met plenty who just gave up alcohol and are scared to go back and scared to have another drink. And whatever works. I always tell people, whatever works for you, fuck everyone else. If you think it works for you, do what you think works for you. But by and large, people recover by imposing moderation, introducing moderation via meaningful ritual back into their lives. And that's exactly what my meaningful ritual, which is one of the 3 tools that I have on the website, does for people. It's very simple. It becomes almost like a secular prayer, and it becomes a ritual in and of itself. It's very simple. There are no moving parts to any of my tools. These are things I put together way back, two of the three back in the mid 1990s when I first started getting uncomfortable with what I saw coming down the pike with the digital society. And the third one I put together basically in 2001 as a corporate exercise for a big ad agency to help them improve the quality of their communications. So that's it's really all about the restoration of meaningful ritual in our lives. And you'll find that there's great compound interest to some meaningful rituals. If you, for instance, if you go to a yoga class, you're not only doing yourself a favor physically, you're doing yourself a favor emotionally with the release of serotonins and endorphins that you produce as a result of working out or doing the yoga. And if you go with a friend, then you have a social benefit to it. And yoga is by and large a Zen pursuit, a kind of spiritual pursuit to begin with. So you're getting all this compound interest. 1 hour of yoga, you get 4 hours of benefit from it. So I have an exercise called My Ritual Inventory that helps people rebuild the meaningful ritual in their lives and benefit from that kind of compound interest in the quality of their lives.
What would you define, or what do you define rather, as institutional tyranny in the context of your work? And can you be more specific on how it has influenced public health and personal freedom?
Yes. All you have to do is look at your smartphone and take a look at all the apps on your smartphone. Every one of those apps represents an institutional relationship that in all likelihood didn't exist for you 15 or 20 years ago. Right? And every one of those apps requires a certain amount of maintenance and attention and devotion. And that's maintenance and attention and devotion that's basically stolen from the personal relationships in your life. So it's one thing to sit on a couch while you're watching a TV program with your better 75%. And, if you pick up your phone while you're watching the TV and she looks at you and say, "What the fuck are you doing? I thought we were watching this program together." Say, "Hold on, honey, I just want to finish with this deposit." Now, who have you put in the foreground and who have you relegated to the back burner in that deal? You've elevated the institution, and the reason is simple. It's because we now think institutionally. We think about the quality of our lives as the elimination of friction from our lives, because that's what the technology does for it. It makes everything convenient. You don't have to run to the bank to deposit your check. You can do it on with your phone now. You don't have to run down to the local mobile station to buy a road map. You can do it on your phone now. All these things that used to require a certain amount of deliberate friction in our lives have been replaced by friction-free devices. And the quality of life, I've come to I'm in my 8th decade now. I've come to understand over the years that the quality of my life is not a reflection of how much friction I can eliminate, but it's a reflection of the deliberate friction I choose to create. And that happens when I choose consciously to slow down and pay attention to my spiritual, social, emotional, and physical well-being. So the institutional tyranny that you just asked about is what happens by default when we replace the personal relationships in our lives over time, because it surely happens, with the relationships, the institutional relationships that are there, not for us, but for them. There's not a single app on your phone that was designed for you. In fact, your phone wasn't designed for you. That phone originally was an office productivity tool in the 1980s and 1990s. And all those office productivity tools evolved as derivatives of the spreadsheet and were put through the pipeline during the dot-com era in one end as office productivity tools, refashioned and rebranded en route, and they all fell into our laps as consumer gadgets, but not one of them was designed to improve the quality of our lives. They were all designed to improve the bottom line. That's why your phone is full of institutional apps. You don't own your phone owns you.
Oh, absolutely. Well, again, that's another form of surveillance that the government and these institutions use to
That's
surveil.
tyranny.
Yeah, I mean, they know everywhere we go. I was shocked the other day when I got a message on my phone, and I didn't have any app open. I just had the phone, and I'm suddenly getting a thing. Would you like to write a journal entry about your visit to this location? And I was at a location at the time, and I kind of like, where is this coming from? And it's coming from the phone. The phone knows where I am without me specifically telling it or asking it to do anything, and then ask if I wanted to write a journal entry about where I was at.
Yes, exactly right. It's one of the things that tipped me off in the early 21st century was when I realized that after 9/11 and the Patriot Act, and when we decided basically it was a good idea to give away our civil liberties in exchange for some phantom security that never evolved somehow. And it occurred to me back then that their ability to track us online, that the NSA and the security state, it had nothing to do with foreign powers at the time. That was the excuse. It was always intended to turn that spotlight inward. It's a domestic enforcement mechanism, and it basically deploys the exact same technologies as the digital advertising and media industry with behavioral targeting and tracking. They're just flip sides of the same surveillance coin. And it doesn't matter who you talk to. You go to the biggest, the guys who move the most data. I remember talking with the young, Turks of the .com era, and I was already in my 40s, my mid 40s when the .com era came along. And I remember them all the grandiose promises that were made in the sale of digital technology and the internet to consumers. And one of them, of course, was the democratization of media. That now everyone would own a printing press, which of course is true. But now, 90% of the bandwidth is owned by 5 companies instead of 75 companies.
Right.
So we own the printing press, but who gives a flying fuck? The printing press is nothing. It's who controls the distribution that matters, and who controls the flow of data. And that you're familiar with the works of Marshall McLuhan, the media ecologist? He's the guy who coined the phrase. He was he was the first popular media ecologist. Media ecology is the study of media systems and how they affect our lives. Right? And it's like any other ecological study. And Marshall McLuhan was the most renowned media ecologist of the modern era. He's a professor. He was originally a religious professor in Toronto, I believe. And he coined the phrase global village, although I think he was actually typing out the phrase global village idiot and just ran out of ink. Anyway, we wound up with global village. And he's also the guy that said the medium is the message. Now, I've written pretty extensively about the transitions of power as media evolved from print to electronic media over the last several centuries. And if you stop and think about it, what happened as soon as movable type became print became the first mass medium, right, with the invention of the Gutenberg press and movable type. And the first book that came off in large scale was the Bible. And what that did, what happened then? Well, not much. All that did was destroy Western theocracies, give rise to nation states, codify laws, give rise to the scientific method and the American, French, and industrial revolutions. Other than that, nothing much meaningful came as a result of that invention. And the social bias, the power construct that the printing press as a mass medium delivered because it basically emphasized linear thought and reason. The age of reason and the Enlightenment were print creations as a result. That's how we came to be. That's how the founding fathers came to be the founding fathers. They were Enlightenment thinkers. They were age of reason thinkers, and it all came as a result of the Gutenberg press, basically, and print as a mass medium, because Thomas Paine could print his pamphlets. Benjamin Franklin owned a printing press and a print shop. So they're all acutely aware of the power of this new medium. And what it did was promote linear thought and reason, and the social construct that it promoted was democracy. And we saw that in effect basically up through the early part of the first half of the 20th century. But the moment electronic media came along, what happened? Well, along with electronic media, and we're talking about radio, motion pictures, photography as transmitted, that as soon as electronic media came along, the exact opposite started to happen. Electronic media don't promote reason and linear thought. They promote tribalism and emotionalism, and they promote big personalities. So you saw the rise of guys like Woodrow Wilson and Mussolini and FDR and Hitler and Mao and Stalin and all these, and Churchill, and all these larger than life world stage personalities that all benefited from radio and then later TV, with broadcast TV took over. And the primary social construct in terms of power and the accrual of power, because that's what all media do, they all accrue power, was not democracy, it was fascism. Fascism is the default tendency of electronic media, whether it's radio or TV or the internet or whatever. I don't know, however innocuous it seems, the default tendency construct for electronic media is fascism, because it's all about the consolidation of power, of state and private power. And that's why it happened so quickly in the dot-com era. That's why we entered the 21st century, is when everything just sort of accelerated. Remember that? Remember how everything just sort of accelerated? And there was this rush of digital scale that was in everyone's face all the time, suddenly. It was just all there. There was no way to escape it. And we went from 85 or 75 or 80 or 85 media franchises that controlled the bandwidth in this country to 5 or 6 at most. And there was this massive consolidation. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 flew under the radar. Most people I talked to never heard of it. And it was what basically untied the hands of the big media guys and the big corporations and promoted, and it was a Clinton administration program, act, the Telecommunications in 1996, which basically took the blinders off and took the shackles off how many media franchises could be owned by any given power. And that's why we have what we have now. The drug dealers, the electronic narcotic dealers, Google and Facebook and TikTok and the other big boy players in the market make the Colombian cartels look like nickel bag dealers in high school bathrooms. These guys are immense, and they have immense power. So the best thing we can do, I never got to the third call to action. The first was turn away from distraction. The second was to moderate our behavior by the reintroduction of meaningful ritual. And the third is a return to local autonomy. Take care of your own backyard. Take care of your own community first. And that's why I have a natural distrust of utopian thinking, because now utopian thinking is all at digital scale. There are no little utopian thoughts anymore. Now they're all about taking over the world. It doesn't go very far. You don't have to travel very far or very long to get out of that utopian dream into the dystopian nightmare. It's instantaneous. It happens so fast. So that's so the migration of migration of electronic media into our lives in the early 21st century at digital scale is what tipped the scale. And that's when I became cautious, or I was already cautious, but things started to take shape in my own head when I saw that the NSA and the deep state agencies were deploying the same technologies as the guys who are running their favorite websites. Same technology.
And of course, it's ironic that we're using that very technology right now to have this conversation.
It's all ironic. Nothing but ironic. Yeah, I've been dealing with that. I was telling Mackenzie, the producer, earlier that's been the bane of my efforts for the last 20 plus years. Every once in a while, someone will come to me and get in my face and say, "Well, you're no better than anybody else. You look how you're promoting your message." I say, if I knew a better way or a different way to do it, I would. I talk to everybody who will listen, but not many people want to hear a message of moderation in a society of excess. That's always been my problem. People say, "Oh, get it out there." Well, if that excess message would move over a little bit, I would, but
right.
It's excess for a reason. And
now,
definition of excess.
This addiction that you talk about, we have become, as a society, very quickly, very much dependent upon the media to get our information. Places like Facebook have actually taken people away from physical relationships, and now it's all about these online relationships where most of the friends that you have you've never met in real life. Given how much society has changed and our behavior has become dependent upon these digital media devices, do you see an escape mode at this point?
Do I see the escape?
Yeah, do you see an escape route?
No, I think Huxwell is going to be with us for the next generation or two at least. I think that's just the natural path of power. It didn't happen overnight. We didn't get here overnight, and it's not going to go away overnight. And the people that have those institutions, it's like a massive class war that's going on right now. It's just a massive class. That's all it is, really. We see a massive shift in wealth up to 1% or 10%, and then put truly up into that 1%. And meanwhile, everyone else gets fucked in the deal, and the price of the value of their dollar goes down, which magically raises the price of everything else. And I don't see an immediate escape. That's why I don't counsel easy solutions. I counsel, working on yourself, working on your family, working on your kids. Get them out of school, homeschool them if you can. Get them out of centralized school, or choose an alternative school. Get them out of public education. Get them out. Do what you can to divorce yourself from centralized, top-down authority and power. If you stop and think about what used to happen at the dinner table, and for many people it still does, but for the most part, we sort of stepped away from that meaningful ritual, and just as we stepped away from the Sabbath day of rest. And both those things happened during my lifetime, and I am here to provide testimony for how horrible the repercussions of the loss of those two simple things have been on this society. When you have a society that's geared up for excess to begin with, and then you take off all the constraints, boom, things just take off. That's what happened in the dot-com era. That's what happened in the first part of the 21st century after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, and all of the institutions were consolidating power. And we're feeling that right now. And we saw our response to 9/11 was a mass formation psychosis that was fed by the media. And we all just willingly gave away our civil liberties for some phantom notice or concept of security. And then when Donald Trump was elected, half the country went nuts, and it was fed by the media. And everybody was told, this guy's going to put us all in chains, or whatever the narrative was. And people just went crazy. And then COVID came along, and that became an extension of Trump derangement syndrome. So you had blue states and red states squaring off, and the blue states did everything they could to divorce themselves from Donald Trump, and vice versa. And all of a sudden, people were just going crazy and turning against their neighbors and their families with Trump and with COVID, and people were in isolation. We hadn't even begun to see the repercussions of what we did to kids in those school lockdowns. We're nowhere even close to realizing that. It was such a horrid abuse of power. And it only happened because people had the power to begin with. They had the power and they exercised it. And that's what happens when you give psychopaths unlimited power, because all these guys are basically, and when they get to that level, they're psychopathic. They no longer care about what's happening to you or me or to our families. They just care about the power and hanging on. That's why there's a 95% incumbency rate in Congress.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's all they care about. So, it's greed all the way around, power all the way around, and it's all a reflection of just massive excess in our lives because we've become a nation of addicts, and we're all behaving accordingly. So, we've all gone nuts.
Given that, how optimistic are you?
I'm actually pretty optimistic.
Really?
I know it doesn't sound that way, but I want people basically to take stock in themselves and in their families and in their communities. Those are the three things that have always proven to offer the answers, the meaningful answers in our lives, to the problems in our lives. Traditionally, when things got tough, we turned to the people we love. We turned to our communities. We turned to town hall. We turned to the local mayor. We turned to the local petition. We turned to the local newspaper. We turned to our dinner tables first and foremost. The dinner table was the original font of actionable local news. Your Aunt Millie's poodle is sick. I'll tell you what, kids, let's go. We'll give her a call after dinner. Or, Bob down the road lost his job after 20 years. Honey, why don't we bake him some cookies and take him and pay him a visit and let him know that he's not alone? All these things. You went to what happened at the PTA meeting. All these things that truly affect our lives, if we pay attention to them, can get better. If we neglect them in favor of a more convenient and defer to a more convenient top-down power, we will pay the consequences and we will suffer the results. That all this stuff that's going on in the school board meetings now, with all these angry parents, came out of COVID, when the parents saw for the first time what their kids were being taught in school, and then showed up. After 20 years of absence, they showed up for the first time, and the school districts have no idea how to handle angry parents because they never had to consider it. They haven't been on the scene for 2 generations. When I was growing up, parents went to the PTA. That's how you knew what was going on with your kids. You give your kid to somebody else for 8 or 10 hours a day, typically want to know. But we have such an we've turned away from our innate distrust of authority, which is healthy. I truly believe that skepticism is our first obligation as citizens of a free society.
Right.
First thing we have to do is be skeptical of all authority, and especially if there's technology attached to it, be skeptical of it. And what we've seen over the last 2 decades, 3 decades, with the advent of personal computers and cable TV, and then the internet, and now social media and smartphones, is we've gradually relinquished that distrust of authority. And now we put all of our trust, all of our faith in some faceless app on phone, and we are behaving just like the good little corporations that they all want us to behave like.
Right.
We've been trained to think like corporations, exclusively in a transaction-free, in a friction-free transactional environment that benefits them. You know, it's a hard thing to deal with, but family, faith, family, community, those are the three pillars. Nothing has changed.
What was the atmosphere during the dot-com madness? And just as a curiosity, how did that influence your career trajectory? Is that when you...
Well, it effectively ended my career, because what it did was it planted the seeds for my distrust. You know, the dot-com movement, I call it a youth movement because that's what it was. It was like the Red Guards of China in the 1960s, the cultural revolution in China, except only a little more illiberal than that. It was a revolution that was created by master degree graduates from top universities who were then given promiscuous money by promiscuous investors and venture capitalists, investment banks and venture capitalists. And the result of that was a culture that, although it was very short-lived, set the stage for a kind of infallibility complex vis-a-vis technology. We always think there's a technological answer to all of our problems now, because in part of what happened in the 80s, 80s and 90s leading up to the 21st century. Our technology was all working pretty much in our favor before then. Television was still a unifying and galvanizing medium up through the end of the 20th century. We watched Tiananmen Square. We watched the fall of the Berlin Wall. We watched the Civil Rights Movement. We watched the Democratic National Convention in 1968 and the anti-war movie, and Vietnam came into our living rooms for the first time. We brought a war into our living rooms. All these things, all these social movements, the great liberation movements of the 1960s, free speech, civil rights, anti-war, Earth First, feminism, all these things that basically happened in the 1960s with all the promise that they carried with them, that rode shotgun with them. All that stuff by the early 21st century had gone away, had been converted. So that the radicals that stormed the university barricades in the 1960s at SF State and Berkeley and Columbia and all these other big universities around the country, that all those student radicals became tenured professors. And they became fat and sclerotic and lazy, and there were no more liberation movements to foist on anybody anymore. That territory had already been claimed by an earlier generation. So now they had to start importing things to make victims out of somebody else. So all those liberation movements in the progressive liberation movements in the 1960s, by the time, 3 or 4 years ago, by the time COVID came about, had turned the corner, so that the anti-war movement, the anti-war radicals were now the first ones in the door for the Ukraine war. They're the first ones basically to promote the military expenditures around the world. We have 800 bases around the world. This is the neocon, neoliberal, monoparty at work, and they are being supported first and foremost right now by academia. And the academia, the professors, the tenured professors, are the same guys that stormed academia 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago now. The same guys. They've all turned illiberal. They've all turned into warmongers, and and the same thing happened with the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement got bought out, and it got paid for, bought and paid for with Great Society programs. So fade out, fade in. 60 years later, the civil rights movement has now been repositioned inside the HR departments of every major institution on the planet right now, and it's thoroughly illiberal and thoroughly racist. Everything about it is racist to the core. All they did was take the plantation mentality from down south at the end of Jim Crow and move it northward and move it into urban centers. You want to see a segregated place? Go to any inner city school system in this country. Go to New York City school system. Go up in Harlem or go to East New York and take a look at those schools. Those are the most segregated institutions on the planet. Go to Baltimore. Go to Chicago. It's the same racism. All they did was dress it up a bit and put people with colored faces on it at the end of the day. And everyone's paid now. It's like the old saying to a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Right.
It's what happens when you pay professional racists. When you pay people, the NAACP and the Black Congressional Congress and BLM, and all these people get paid millions of dollars basically to hunt down racism, and as a consequence, that's all they find. That's all, because that's all they're paid to look for. Same thing with the ADL and anti-Semitism right now. Same thing with gender theory and transphobia, and LGBTQ, all people who are paid basically, and NGOs and not-for-profits who are paid basically to root out transphobia. That's all they find, because that's all they're paid to look for. So, we're basically done. What digital scale has done, and the real tragedy of digital scale, is that it has industrialized every component of society, good and bad. So now civil rights is an industrial strength racism. Now the gay rights movements of the 1960s and 70s is industrial strength mob rule. Anything. I figured out.
Can you explain your position on that?
On which?
The LGBTQ.
Yeah, I think that it's like any LGBTQ, the gay rights, the lesbian rights movements of the 1960s and 70s were like all the other liberation movements. They were necessary. They were important component parts of moving the needle forward as a nation and as a society. Digital, fade out, fade in, come the early 21st century, and digital technology, and suddenly everybody's got a megaphone, and suddenly it becomes enormously profitable for corporations basically to sidle up to liberation movements, or what used to be liberation movements, and pay them millions of dollars and sponsor their activities and promote them in the government, in government agencies now. They have their own separate basically components within government agency, massive government agencies now, that essentially has become industrialized. And the industrialization of the liberal cause turns into the illiberal tyranny. So that social justice, trans justice, green justice, racial justice, any form of justice that requires a modifier has become, in essence, just a form of good old-fashioned mob justice in the 21st century. They basically beat people over the heads with memes, and people are being canceled. You lose a job, you lose friends, you lose family. They've made society, which should be offering succor to these people, they've made it a minefield for everyone. It's what's happened to comedy in this country. It's what's, my whole family has been involved in comedy for decades. And, it's what's happened to comedy in this country, and the arts in this country has been tragic because of the industrialization of what I call victimhood tyranny. So,
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. You've got an article on your website, The Tyranny of Victimhood Culture, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yes. Actually, I refer back to that in something I published today about what's going on between Israel and Hamas, which is the only thing I've written about that. I've been really quiet about it all this time. But the tyranny of victimhood culture is what happens when we give in to the idea that we can somehow eliminate victimhood or victims in culture, in society. And every time we try to do that, all we do really is create a new class of victims. We can certainly reduce, and you touched on this in your monologue, we can certainly reduce racism, and we can certainly reduce misogyny and other forms of anti-feminism thought and behavior in this society. We can certainly throttle back and moderate all these adverse and deleterious behaviors in our lives. But the moment we try to eliminate them entirely is the moment we turn the corner into that utopian thinking. And that's when we get ahead of ourselves and get way out over our skis. So I have no problem with the idea of equality. I have a problem when, or even for that matter, that there should be some form of equity, at least in the opportunity.
Right.
If not in result. I'm not a big fan of equity in result because I'm just not a fan of trying to litigate equal outcomes. Going in the door is one thing. Coming out the door is something else. Coming out the door, you have to rely on yourself. You rely on your wits. You rely on your ability to produce by virtue of your own merit and tenacity and whatever. But the idea is that we have become a Western society in particular, and certain Middle Eastern societies, at least, I think the Arab culture, the Muslim culture at large, has a tyranny, has a victimhood mentality. And that's understandable because every major institution in the world, worldwide, global institution, has told them what victims they are and how oppressed they've been for the last 100 and 150 years since the Ottoman Turks dropped out of the picture in World War I. So ever since then, they've been told how oppressed they've been and what victims they are, and that extends primarily to the Palestinians now. The Palestinians and entire generations of Palestinians have been raised with the notion that they're victims.
Well, to be fair, though, they are victims.
Well, some of them have been victimized, no doubt about it, but they've been at least victimized at their own hands, at least as much as they have by anybody else. Now, granted, there have been world powers that passed through the Middle East for ages now, right. But a lot of them were some of them were Muslim. So some of them, came and went. Everybody has had empires in that regard. Everyone has been victimized. The world is full of victims. History is full of victims. The question is, at what point in time do I step outside that definition as the primary characteristic of who I am? And where do I go from here? And the Palestinians haven't made that turn yet in their own thinking, in their own minds, in their own hearts and minds. And as a result, they are being victimized by every major elite institution in the world right now. The world wants the Palestinians to be victims in the exact same sense that the same elite institutions and power brokers in this country want the blacks to remain victims, because it's a big industry. Victimization is a huge industry right now. BLM showed it. What's going on now on college campuses and around the world, raising funds and interest in the Palestinian cause, has already been industrialized. That is big monies. The leadership of Hamas right now is in penthouses in Qatar, counting their billions. Arafat counted his billions. He died with $3 billion in his name, to his name. It didn't come as a result of his lecture circuit, I'll tell you that. So all these people basically all of us have a choice at a certain point in time. Yes, we've been victimized. The Jews are the perennial victims. They've always been perennial victims. I had the same discussion. I wrote about it today. I published about it today with a dear friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, who is a a strong cohort of the Palestinian cause. And he's very much anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish state. He's not anti-Jewish, just anti-Jewish state.
Right.
And I was having this discussion with him, and right after I published the article, The Tyranny of Victimhood Culture, and I was explaining it to him, and I told him how I had singled out, basically, I've listed all these victimized cultures over the years and singled out basically American Black and Palestinian cultures for one defining characteristic, which is violence within the culture and martyrdom, violence and martyrdom. And he said, well, wait a second, the Jews are like the ultimate victims. They'll never let us forget about the Holocaust. And I said, yeah, that's true enough, but that's certainly not the defining feature of Jewish culture, or even how Jews look at themselves as a defining feature, or the state of Israel for that matter. The state of Israel was reborn 3 years after the Holocaust. They went from being victims to, grabbing the reins and saying, you know where to find us. So there's a difference between being a victim and having a victimhood culture. Yes, right now, the Palestinians in Gaza are being victimized by the entire world. Israel not least. Being victimized by the entire world. But, that's they're, as a people, as a culture, they're only 75 years old, really. I know that they're historical antecedents to the Palestinians and the indigenous people in the land of Israel before Zionism reintroduced a larger Jewish population back into Palestine, or I guess, what was then Palestine. I understand that, but as a culture, they're very, very, very young. And when the rest of the world is saying, hey, you poor guy, here's $1 billion a year, use it, take it, feed your people, do what you want with it, build some tunnels, who cares? You're a victim, you deserve it. When people are being rewarded and championed by sheer virtue of their victim status, that's a real problem.
Well, I don't think the Palestinians are being told that right now they're massive famine is going on. Humanitarian aid isn't getting in. Israel is just bombarding these
Palestinian victim narrative has been going on since 1948, since the Nakba, since the disaster for the Palestinians. That narrative has been intact for 75 years now, and the world has basically rallied around that narrative because it's a convenient place for the Arab nations in the Middle East and for the oil companies and for lots of other big interests, big rich interests, to rally around that particular cause and continue that sideshow just to take the focus off what's going on over here. And what's going on over here is not a single one of those societies has ever done a damn thing for its own people. So, let's go vilify the West for a while, and that's all well and good. There's plenty to vilify, God knows, But this is a sideshow. What's happening with this victimhood tyranny, and I call it a tyranny because the people who get fucked over the worst are the people who most consider themselves victims and who are most taught to think of themselves as victims. The whole idea of telling a kid in an inner city school, a black kid in an inner city school in this country, that he has to go to a failing school because what the hell, he's never going to make it out of there anyway, just consigns him to a life of poverty, nihilism, go join a gang, go shoot somebody, so that's all we expect of you. You're a victim. It's a horrifying thing to press upon a people. It's bad enough to do that to an individual. To do that to an entire people for generations is a criminal act. It's a crime against humanity. It steals generational dreams. It consigns people to a generational poverty and death and pain and misery. And the only way they can get out of it is of their own device. Israel is not going to back off. Israel's got its own problems right now. They're not worried about the Palestinians. They're worried about their own problems right now. The rest of the world, is not going to step in to save the Palestinians. They want them as victims. That's what the Abraham Accords were all about. The Abraham Accords just found a way to negotiate without the Palestinians because they couldn't negotiate with the Palestinians. So they took all these Arab nations that had long held animosity towards Israel, and they said, hey, look, why don't you negotiate in your own better self-interest for a change? Put this to the side. We may get back to that at a later point in time. Maybe not, but you've got your own fish to fry. Let's talk about how we can do something together. And they did that. And it was a remarkable thing what happened. It was something that no one ever thought they would see in their lifetimes. And it's all because they put the tyranny of victimhood aside long enough to pursue their own better self-interest. That's the only way it works. Not that I don't have compassion for the Palestinians or compassion for blacks or Hispanics or gays or anybody else who's victimized in the course of their lifetimes. But, we're all victims in the course of our lifetimes. That's the way it goes. We make a choice either to move on or not. And for those who don't decide to move on, it pretty much guarantees they're going to remain victims. Again, small steps, moderate steps. The best thing they can do for themselves is right now is if they do what they can to survive the current conflagration, and after that, look for better ways to govern themselves and look for better people in charge, because it's been disastrous for them. Yeah. Everything about it on the West Bank and in Gaza has been disastrous for those people. And, you can blame some of it on the Israelis. I have no problem with that. But, that's you teach people we teach people how to treat us at the end of the day. If you stand up and say, hey, I want to be friends, I want to put this behind me, that's going to go a long ways towards making things a lot better real fast. That's all it takes. Yeah.
What kinds of cultural or, I guess I'll say, policy changes do you believe are necessary to support the goal of your movement?
I would not look for policy changes from the top. Anything at the top levels of the federal government, for instance, federal agencies, anything that decentralizes or reduces their power, I'm all in favor for. That's why I think that term limits would probably be a really good idea. If we can just keep them all up in the air with no idea why they're there or what the fuck they're doing tomorrow, we'll probably be a lot better off than if they actually have time to sit down and contemplate how they're going to stay in power. So anything on a top level, on a top-down level, that promises to decentralize our lives, I'm all for that. Conversely, anything from the grassroots up on a local, on a household, on a faith, family, community basis, I'm very much in favor of that, because I think that's where all the answers always reside. I think that what we have to do is divorce ourselves, disabuse ourselves of the notion that the government is here to help.
Well, the government that we have sure as hell isn't here to help. I mean, it helps
I don't think that many governments are there to help. I think they reach a certain size and a certain age and a certain maturation, and they become sclerotic and old and fat, and they start looking out after themselves, and suddenly you have things like career politicians.
Yeah.
What a corrupt notion. So the best way to avoid that is to think and act locally. One of the great digital myths came to pass, came to pass in the late 20th century, in the .com era, was the idea that we are somehow mythically equipped to think globally and act locally. It's just a complete mythology. The only ones that can think globally and act locally are those global institutions that are big enough and ubiquitous enough to think globally and act locally at the same time. For the rest of us, the very best we can do is think locally and act locally.
Excuse me.
So get rid of that globally from that little homily, and you're on the right track. Think locally, act locally, and you're moving in the right direction, which is bottom. So that's any policy that promotes local autonomy, any policy that local communities can do to wrest education out of the public school system and put it in other hands that are more answerable to the local population, I think is probably a really good place to start, because the parents are already there and they're already angry. So I would encourage all parents to get deeply involved with in your local school districts, push a school choice agenda, make sure the money follows your kid and not the school. If at all possible, find some ingress into a faith-based organization that makes sense for you and that contributes to the community. I'll tell you, when the shit hits the fan during hurricanes and floods, things of that nature, the very first guys you want to see are the guys from your local church or synagogue in that boat rowing up the road. They're the first guys you want. They're the guys who know you. They're the guys who know your community. They have the sensibilities that you have, and they're there to help. And that's what they do. So I just don't think that we can survive as a nation without local faith-based organizations' input and participation, because they're so valuable. Almost regardless of the specific religion or philosophy, I think anything we can do to get out of our own heads and worship or pray to or pay attention to something greater than ourselves is time really well spent. Anything that makes us feel grateful first thing in the morning, because that's the best way to start your day. Gratitude is a great healer.
I understand that you have a film that is that correct?
I'm working on a second film. My first film was published back in 2017. It was called Brave New Digital World, The Revelation. And it was about the rise. It was about my work on the compliance mechanism of default state-sponsored addiction. And it was about the rise of a society, basically, where that preceded the crackdown, that had preceded the enforcement mechanism. Now we're in the enforcement mechanism, and those two dystopian visions have come together in Huxwell. So I'm producing a documentary called The Rise of Huxwell, based on an essay that I wrote several years ago that you can find on the Quality of Life Resistance Movement. It's called The Rise of Huxwell. And this documentary will probably be about an hour long. I'm just finishing up the script now. I'm trying to raise money for it. I'm crowdfunding. It's very slow going, but I'm trying to crowdfund what I can to stay in production with it. You can go to Give, Send, Go and look for Rise of Huxwell, or you can just go to HTTP. You can just go to riseofhuxwell.com and you'll see my crowdfunding page there. So if you want to participate, by all means, please do.
Can you repeat that web address where people can go to?
Yes, Rise of Huxwell, RiseofHuxwell.com. Huxwell is the amalgam of Huxley and Orwell.
Oh, okay. I didn't get that until just now. I'm sorry.
You will when you see it.
Well, I believe we have a trailer for this film, correct?
Well, you have a trailer that's actually borrowed from Brave New Digital World, The Revelation, but it speaks well to the compliance mechanism of state-sponsored default addiction. So yeah, it's very much along the exact same lines. I use it as a trailer because I haven't produced the real trailer yet.
Okay, well, let's give it a listen and a play.
There will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak. Producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies, so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda and brainwashing, or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution. We are watching Huxley's vision of a dystopian, brave new world controlled by state-sanctioned addiction unfold right before our eyes. And sure enough, we rather enjoy it. The only surprise is that the pharmacological agents he warned against aren't delivered in pill or liquid or other physical form. And we don't call them soma or heroin or crystal meth or crack. They're delivered in bits and bytes instead, and we call them media.
Very powerful.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a very powerful theme.
Yes, it definitely is. What happens to our time, money, and freedom when this state-sponsored addiction becomes the agenda rather than the exception?
Well, we all know what happens to our time. We now, average American consumes, depending on which consumption report you choose to believe, anywhere from 10 to 15 hours a day of media. So we know where our time goes. The greatest complaint in modern society is, I just don't have enough time for this. That's the ubiquitous complaint of everybody. And yet we spend 10 to 15 hours a day consuming all this media. So that's where our time goes. It steals our time. In terms of our money, the average American family, not right now, but up until recently, was spending more on media consumption every month than on groceries.
Right.
So we're spending a lot of money on media consumption to the tunes of hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars each and every year. Bear in mind that the commercial advertising budgets over the last 2 to 3 generations have eclipsed $20 trillion. Now, if you can imagine how $20 trillion over time might affect someone's behavior. So people just sort of, I'm not affected by that. It's just a commercial, But they don't buy that. They don't spend that kind of money for nothing. That stuff works for a reason. So our money is being invested in this mechanism by huge corporations, huge government agencies are buying into these media with the expressed intent to modify our behavior. Trillions of dollars over the last several generations. And that's a fact. And very few people think of it in those terms. I'm an old advertising guy. I'm always thinking about how much money I can get in my next advertising budget.
Right.
So I always thought about it that way. So that's the money part of it. Where TV, because everything is on TV, everything becomes commensurately more expensive. TV wrecks the joint. TV drives up the cost of everything because it's so expensive to be there. freedom. What's happening to our freedom? Well, how healthy has it been for us to invest our democracy in television over the last 2 or 3 generations? How much better off are we for it now? Do we know more about the truth now than we used to? Do we have a more profound grasp of the issues than we used to? What are we really buying when we turn on TV? What are we really watching when we watch the news? So, are we freer now than we were? I'll tell you just anecdotally, when I was a kid, I was so much freer than my daughter was in the early 2000s growing up. I became a father very late in life. But when I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s, I could disappear from the house for the entire day as long as I showed up at the dinner table when the food was put on the table. My parents didn't care. They didn't worry. I was so much freer to say what I want, to think what I want, to go where I wanted, to do what I wanted to do. I was so much freer back then, up until really the early 21st century when the crackdown started and we started giving away our freedoms in exchange for convenience and entertainment value. So we are losing our freedom. We lost it in the Patriot Act. We lost it in 2008 with the transfer of $1 trillion to companies, to banks that were already way too big to fail. People look at what's happening now and they think that way too big to fail, or things like too big to fail or default, addiction are somehow the consequences of, or the unintended consequences of bad plans or a failure to plan. People say, how did we get here? What went wrong? Well, you might want to consider, given that $20 trillion investment in advertising over the last few generations, that maybe it didn't go wrong at all. Maybe it went right for somebody.
Right.
Maybe too big to fail is the plan. Maybe state-sponsored default addiction is the plan. Maybe mass formation psychosis that move people into certain behaviors for long periods of time is the plan. We have the tools to do that now. We have the tools at the flick of a switch to move millions of people in one direction or another. And we have the tools to do it every day, endlessly, 24/7. So the very best thing we can do for ourselves in terms of our time and our money and freedom all harkens back to what I discussed before with the 3 calls to action. Find a different place to turn your attention, something that's going to do you some spiritual, social, emotional, or physical good. Learn how to moderate your behavior vis-a-vis your own obsessive compulsive behaviors and addictions through the introduction of, or the reintroduction of, meaningful rituals in your lives. Again, rituals that contribute to your spiritual, social, emotional, or physical well-being, and reassert local autonomy in your life. Pay attention to what's going on in your own backyard, in your own community. Those are the way, that's the ladder out. Those 3 things are the way out. There is no utopian solution. There is no top-down solution. That's how we got in this mess in the first place. They're all top-down solutions these days. I don't know how many things in your life that you spend time with on a daily basis are grassroots. It almost all comes from above, and it's all sort of accepted. Will this be good or bad for me? But it's a default. We basically default to the central authority, to the top-down authority now. When at the end of the day, those fuckers work for us.
In theory.
It's easy to remind them of that. Just turn it off and walk away. Re-establish your freedom to walk away. That is the most fundamental freedom that we have. Beyond freedom of religion, free exercise of religion, beyond freedom of speech, beyond freedom of to assemble or to petition the government. All those freedoms in the First Amendment are great. The Second Amendment's great, just in case the first one doesn't work out. All these freedoms, all these constitutional freedoms are great, but they all depend first and foremost on our willingness to say fuck you and walk away and go live your life, find another way. And it's within us to do that because there's so much abundance around us all the time. And there's so much love and graciousness and generosity of spirit. I've been witness to so much inspiration and so much love and generosity of spirit in my lifetime. I'm so lucky to witness so many great things in my lifetime, and most of them had nothing to do with the news. Most of them happened to do with my daughter or my significant other, my wife or my family, my brother, or, my uncle or whatever, or watching Willie Mays. I was lucky enough to grow up watching Willie Mays play baseball at the height of his career. Can you imagine? What a great thing. What a truly great thing to do. I grew up in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s when all that rock and roll was going on, when all those freedom movements were all coming to a head somewhere around me in the Bay Area at that time. I was lucky enough to witness all that and all the greatness that was invoked by those movements. And I've been very fortunate that way. And it's an easy thing. Once you get in the habit, gratitude is an easy thing to call upon. So that's my 2 cents.
Perfect. Well, we're going to have to walk away here. Time is winding down. I'd like to give you the last word. Is there anything that you'd like to that we didn't talk about that you'd like to address to our audience?
Yeah, I'd love for people to go to Quality of Life Resistance Movement, read the welcome document that's right there on the home page. That'll tell you everything you need to know, and you go from there according to your whims and dictates. And I'd like people to check out riseofhuxwell.com as well. See if that's fascinating enough for you to compel some sort of donation. That would be great. Otherwise, I would say find solace and comfort and succor in the ones you love and in your own backyard and around your own dinner table, and find a reason to be grateful first thing every morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. Love to have you back in the future, especially as this film gets going. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in. This is Crusade America, and we will see you next Tuesday.
Thank you for being. I'm Josh, and I know that I know nothing. But I created this podcast to help awaken my spirit.
Jamil is